The following content has been provided by RWTH Aachen University.
All right, so we're now going to move on to some different kinds of prototyping. And when I say prototyping, you probably think, that's got something to do with coding. And the first couple versions of prototyping don't, right? They are analog prototypes, if you like. They don't involve a computer at all. This is, as scary as that may sound for a computer scientist, not even drawn with a computer, okay? This was drawn with these things they call pens on what they call paper. And that is for a reason, which we'll get to in a minute. That's just an example of what these kinds of things could look like. So you can see somebody sketched out an interface here, just black and white, simple. It looks hand-drawn, and that's absolutely fine. In fact, that's almost a requirement for a prototype that you do on paper, not to look too flashy. It's typically your first prototype that you do, a paper prototype, because it's quick. You can just doodle it out on a piece of paper, and it's cheap. You don't spend a lot of money building code, right? Because developing software, you guys, once you sit down and code, you're really expensive, right? So we want to make sure that we don't waste your time in a company when you're working there writing code that then in the end we don't need. So that's why we do paper prototypes, because they're done very quickly. Your very first prototype could actually be something like a storyboard. So when you draw a storyboard and say, remember those recognition glasses, the little storyboard I did from before Christmas? You know, Bob with his recognition glasses or without his recognition glasses. This was a little comic strip, like 2 panels without recognition glasses, had this awkward meeting with Tim, and then with the recognition glasses, he recognized who Tim was, and everything's fine. That was a paper prototype, or a storyboard, really, that showed you what the situation of the user could be like when they had the prototype, when they had the system. And so your very first prototype could actually be not an interface sketch per se, but actually a little story, right, that you tell in this kind of comic strip fashion. And that's used a lot of times if you ever watched, Blu-ray or DVD making-offs, from any movies, then you know that, there's sometimes they show you for animated movies how people pitch the story and stuff like this. And that's kind of what you do. You take the story and you tell it to others. You tell it to users. You say, does this story make sense to you? Let me tell you how I imagine my interaction with those recognition glasses. Would that be a cool product? And then people might have very basic first comments on the design that you've made up. So your first prototype could be a storyboard. Once you move beyond just having the storyboard, because the storyboard is kind of zoomed out most of the time. It looks at the person in context, in the environment, and the system itself isn't really focused on. Remember the recognition glasses, we didn't really see how the glasses worked exactly. We didn't have a zoom in on what Bob sees, in his glasses. We just said, he's wearing this thing, and it does something. It helps him recognize this other person. So once you move beyond that, then you get into actually seeing the interface. So then you sketch on paper, you sketch the actual UI. And that's sort of the idea of a paper prototype. It's a rough paper and pencil sketch of the interface or of central parts of the interface, central dialogues that you think are the most important ones. We do these by hand. We don't use a computer. We don't even use a ruler. And yeah, now you're drawing freehand lines on paper. I know that's really scary, but it's for a reason. The point is, and this is important, and people often don't understand this, and they try to make their paper prototype like, computer precision clean. You don't make it in a very detailed way. You don't make it in a very polished way, because if you do, then 2 things happen. The first thing is, if you make them very polished, then people will start addressing the small issues in the interface. If you make the buttons, computer drawn and they are orange and whatever, and they have a perfect shadow and all that, then people get drawn to those details. If you just doodle a button, then they realize, all right, it's going to be a button. I don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but it's a button, and that's all they know about it. So they can think about, is it useful to have a button there, or should this be maybe a menu bar, or should this be something else? So you want to have people focus on the broad decisions you've made, the major points you've decided in your interface design by making that prototype. There's other issues with those if you make polished prototypes, and that is basically that people tend to think that you've spent a lot of time making this thing, and then they are hesitant to criticize. You know, it looks like, wow, he spent months of making this wonderful prototype. I'm not going to criticize this anymore because I don't want to ruin all their work. And then finally, we're going to get to this again later, but I like to say this now. If you make a really polished prototype, it might look like you're almost done, right? And that's a dangerous message to send to management. Say like, oh, looks like they're almost done. This looks like it's a working system. So you make sure your prototypes are paper, they're simple, they're sketched, and you focus on high-level interface design. Of course, it's a lot of work. It can be a lot of work. If you have a complex system that has lots of different states, lots of different submenus and screens or whatnot, an app with lots of different screens that you need to go through, it's a lot of work to draw those things. And also, if I just have a paper prototype, then basically I just have these UI sketches. So if I plunk down a stack of paper and say, here's the interface, you don't know how it works. So I need to drive the interface. I need to be the person who knows how the interface works. So I ask you, where do you want to click on this first start screen? And you say, oh, I'm going to choose new document. And then I have to go through and find the right page and put that in front of you and say, that's what it looks like now. So I, the designer, am usually the person who then runs the test, or in larger corporations, this is different jobs, different people, but somebody needs to run the test, run the interface basically, be the smarts behind the UI, so that the user can work with the paper prototype. Because the paper prototype itself is just paper. It doesn't do anything. And then finally, there are situations where a paper prototype is really hard to do, right? A phone menu, right, where you basically, or like a voice menu where you need to navigate using voice, that's hard to do. You could write down the voice sentences, but it doesn't quite convey the same impression. Or situations like very immersive designs, like games, are tricky to do in paper prototypes because there is not such a thing as a standard screen that you look at. You could do some parts of a game design with paper prototypes, but it might be hard, especially if you have like 3D immersive landscapes or something. Okay, so there's two types of paper prototypes which I'm not going to talk about. The first one are still like storyboards, like the ones that we've already seen. You basically just put several frames with snapshots of your user interface on one page. It's like a little comic, right? You label each of them. You say what's going on in this one, what is the purpose of that point, and you make sure that the connections between those frames are also clear, like from where do I get to where, and why do I get from frame 1 to frame 2, right? It's like a little state chart, if you like. But every node has a little picture, a snapshot of the UI. That, however, only allows you to show really pretty much one fixed interaction sequence. If you say, like, this is there, and then the user does this, that's why panel 2 is there, and then the user does this, that's why panel 3 is there. It doesn't have a lot of branches and options. This is kind of like a storyboard, but you zoom in more on the user interface. You show a little more of the user interface, you show a little more of the user interacting with it, maybe the user's hand, not so much the sort of big zoom out on the entire environment of the task. The second type of paper prototype is a flipbook, where you basically take a bunch of pages and you sketch every single user interface state, screenshot on one page. You can imagine this really nicely with a mobile app, right? A mobile app has often distinct screens that you move through by tapping buttons, and those could all be sketched on individual little cardboard pages. And then you basically collect those in a loosely bound flipbook that flips over easily. You show the start screen page, and then you ask the user, what do you want to do? He taps on something like I described before, and then you flip through and find the right page after that. So that allows you to simulate the user interface for a user. If you have a fixed drawn comic with 3-4 panels, then there's only one sequence. If you have a flipbook where you can go through, you got more choices. Show you a couple examples here. This was a prototype that was done in a past DIS1 student project in 2010 from an iPad application. So this person, they had to make up some health application. So they created a frame from a cardboard box that allowed users to actually hold the box in their hand while testing. And this was when the iPad had pretty much just come out, so that this was a new format, so people weren't really familiar with it. That's why we had them create this sort of very hands-on prototype. The the scenario in this one, the usage scenario, the like A, B, C, what happens, the sequence is fixed. So basically, it's a stack of papers in here, and every time the tester shows this to the user and says, here's the start screen, and now imagine you press this button. And then he pulls this out, and then comes page number 2. He can't flip through them because they're all slotted into this. You could, of course, sketch different screens on a stack of sheets and then always slide the right one into the cardboard frame if you want it to be a little more interactive and give the user some choices. So here's an example of what that looked like for the user. You would start out with this sort of patient overview here, overview of the patient's information. The buttons lead to more detailed information, and then the designer would say, okay, now imagine you wanted to find out more about the patient's history, right? So you tap the history button, and then when you tap the history button, there's a little finger going up, you get to this screen, right? So this screen shows you his various examinations that he's been through in the past, and you have a timeline showing those, the patient and all his tests. So what happens if I touch on the X-ray maybe here? Let's see what happens then. We get an enormously precise, anatomically correct X-ray, and we do see the problem there. Seems to be a broken bone. So that's a detailed view of the X-ray image with additional information. So that's the idea of this sort of paper prototype that you can go through. But you see there's only one sequence that the designer kind of needs to tell the user.
This content was provided by RWTH Aachen University.